Hey guys, so as the month of September comes to a close, we essentially have just one more month before the midterms on the 8th of November. These Senate elections really are fast approaching. We are only now 39 days away, and we're getting tons of new polls every single day, new data released on a very regular basis. And today, we'll be taking a look at the 2022 Senate map based solely on the polling averages in every single one of the races on this map. And so we do have a lot to go over today, and we'll start off with the state of Washington and then move across the western half of the continental United States, the Midwest, the Northeast, and then finish off here in the Southeast with the race in Florida. So in Washington, Patty Murray currently leads by 9.8% against Tiffany Smiley. The race is closer than it was in 2016 when Murray won her fourth term by 18 points. Now she's running for a fifth. However, she did win an outright majority in the blanket primary a couple of months ago, winning 52% of the vote, which means that everyone that opposed Murray, if they all vote for Tiffany Smiley, Patty Murray would still win her re-election. So she's basically guaranteed to win, but the margin is probably going to be significantly lesser than her margin of 6 years ago, and so that's why Patty Murray is currently only expected to win by a less than double-digit margin according to the polls. And so Washington is going to be the first state on our map, and it's going to be likely Democratic. Now, we do not have polls from Oregon or California, but Ron Wyden and Alex Padilla are easily going to win their re-elections. Ron Wyden to a third term, and then Alex Padilla to his first full term after being appointed to the U.S. Senate in just 2021 by Gavin Newsom. And then in the state of Idaho, Mike Crapo is running for his fifth term, just like Patty Murray, and he's easily going to win his re-election in the solid red state of Idaho. However, in the silver state of Nevada, we do have a significantly more competitive election between Catherine Cortez Masto and Adam Laxalt. Masto only leads by 0.7% in the polls, her smallest margin ever for this race, and this election is going to be one of the defining races of the 2022 election cycle. It's going to be either Nevada or Georgia that ends up determining which party will win the majority in the upper chamber of Congress, and things are not looking too great for Democrats in Nevada right now. Adam Laxalt has led in all four of the latest polls for this race. Insider Advantage, the Trafalgar Group, Data for Progress, and Emerson College, they all have Laxalt leading over Masto. And of course, we also have a governor election between Steve Sisolak and Joe Lombardo occurring at the same time this year. So both races are very close, but right now I think that Catherine Cortez Masto is probably going to underperform Steve Sisolak, her Democratic counterpart in the gubernatorial election. So Masto really is in trouble. 538 only gives her a 54% chance at winning. I think that at this point she is still slightly the favored candidate as the incumbent, but she very well could lose, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens in the next 5 weeks, as they will be crucial in determining whether or not Catherine Cortez Masto will win her second term in Congress. But right now the polls suggest a tilt margin of victory for Masto. Next up in Utah, Mike Lee is in a surprisingly close race. Despite winning his election in 2016 by 42%, he currently only leads by 7 points against Evan McMullin, who is a conservative independent. And of course, with the Trump brand being unpopular in Utah, he really does stand a chance. Democrats also endorsed McMullin instead of nominating their own candidate for the first time in Utah history. So McMullin could make an impact on this race and be the third independent senator in the upper chamber of Congress and the only conservative independent in the Senate, but things still seem unlikely for McMullin. Mike Lee is still the favored candidate. 538 gives him a 93% chance at winning this race, but it is interesting to see that Utah has a close election with Mike Lee only up by 7 points in the polls. And moving on to Arizona, Mark Kelly, the incumbent Democrat, leads by 7.4% against Blake Masters. Kelly was first elected in 2020 in a special election against Martha McSally. Without this election, Democrats would not have won the majority in 2020. And so Mark Kelly is a pretty strong incumbent, I think. Definitely the strongest out of the three incumbents in Nevada, as well as Georgia, and then, of course, Arizona. But Mark Kelly running against Blake Masters seems to be a matchup that Republicans have not thought through very well at all. Blake Masters was the weakest out of the top three nominees in the GOP primary, the other two being Jim Layman and Mark Bronovich. Both of these candidates would have done better against Mark Kelly than Blake Masters, but with the endorsement of Donald Trump, Masters became the Republican nominee for the Senate election in Arizona, and he has been behind in every single poll that has ever been released for this race. So it'll be almost impossible for Mark Kelly to lose his re-election. 538 gives him an 83% chance chance at winning his first full term in office, and the polls currently suggest a likely margin of victory for the Democratic incumbent. Now, in the state of Colorado, we're seeing Michael Bennet run for re-election with Joe Dea as his Republican challenger, and Bennet leads by 9.1%. 6 years ago, Bennet won his re-election to a second term by 5.7% against Darrell Glenn. He did outperform Hillary Clinton, but I do expect Bennet to win by an even larger margin after John Hickenlooper defeated incumbent Republican Cory Gardner in 2020 by 9.3%. So Democrats have definitely dominated Colorado politics for the last decade, and things are only becoming better and better as the state shifts more and more to the left. So Michael Bennet up by 9.1% in the polls currently. I expect a likely margin of victory. I think double digits is within the realm of possibility, but I do think that no matter what, Michael Bennet is going to do better than he did in 2016, making Colorado our third likely Democratic state on this map. And now we're going to go over the 4 states in the very center of the country. We actually have 5 races because of the special election in Oklahoma, the only special election of the year. We don't have polls in North Dakota, but we do have polls in all 4 of the remaining elections for basically the first time ever. In South Dakota, Brian Bangs is the Democratic challenger to incumbent John Thune, and John Thune leads on average by 24%. The most recent poll actually shows Thune up by 13 points, but this poll was conducted by the Brian Bangs campaign, so obviously it's going to be biased in favor of Democrats, but I think that this poll really was very interesting. John Thune is not a popular senator considering how red of a state South Dakota is. It voted for Donald Trump by 26 points in 2020 and 29 points in 2016. So of course South Dakota is not going to flip. We saw a victory for John Thune by 44% 6 years ago, but I do think the race is going to be closer than it was last time, and so South Dakota is going to be a solid Republican state, but I think that the race can get interesting, especially with that new poll that was released. In the state of Kansas, we're seeing Jerry Moran lead by 17.3% on average against Holland. Holland is the Democratic nominee in this election. Mark Holland really doesn't stand too much of a chance, as he has less than a 1% chance at flipping the seat. We're going to have a very competitive governor election between Laura Kelly and Derek Schmidt, as Laura Kelly, Democratic incumbent, seeks to win a second term in office. But on the senatorial level, it's going to be an easy win for Jerry Moran, who won his race in 2016 by 29.9%. And then in Oklahoma, we of course have the 2 races with 1 special election. The regular election is between James Lankford and Madison Horn, and the special election is between Mark Wayne Mullen and Kendra Horn. No relationship between the 2 Democratic nominees, but James Lankford is the incumbent. He won his re-election in 2016 by 43%. And then Mark Wayne Mullen is currently a member of the U.S. House, and he was basically the default successor to Jim Inhofe, who is resigning after this term. So as of right now, both races are going to be solid for the GOP, with Mark Wayne Mullen leading by 17% in the special election and James Lankford by 21.7% in the regular election. And so now we have the entirety of the western half of the continental U.S. done. We do not actually have polls from Hawaii. This race is going to be solid for Democrats. Brian Schatz is fully expected to win his re-election to a second term. However, in Alaska, we have a very interesting race. Lisa Murkowski, who decided to impeach Donald Trump after the insurrection at the Capitol. She voted in favor of impeachment alongside Mitt Romney and I believe 6 other Republicans. And so that has made her a target, and Donald Trump has endorsed Kelly Tshibaka, a MAGA Republican, in this race, and she actually has a considerable chance at becoming the next U.S. Senator from Alaska. But seeing that Sarah Palin and Nick Begich both lost the special House election to Democrat Mary Peltola a couple of weeks ago, I think that Kelly Tshibaka is relatively safe as the much more moderate choice. She's only up by 2 points with an average of the 2 most recent polls. In the final ballot, Tshibaka and Murkowski are tied according to the most recent poll, and an earlier one, Murkowski only up by 4%. So this race is going to be very interesting. Polls in Alaska have actually proven to be pretty accurate, especially for that House election. But right now, it's going to be solid, as of course both of the top 2 candidates are Republicans. Whether or not it's Kelly Tshibaka or Lisa Murkowski, it's not going to make that much of a difference overall. But Lisa Murkowski is the more moderate choice, and I do think that she is the favored candidate in this race. And now we're going to move on to the eastern half of the country, starting off with the 4 races that are so west of the Mississippi. We actually have polls from every single one of these elections, going from Iowa all the way down to Louisiana. So in Iowa, Chuck Grassley is seeking an 8th term in office, and he is actually in the closest race he's been in since his first one in 1980. In 2004, Grassley won by 42%. In 2010, 31%. And then most recently in 2016, only a margin of 24% separated Chuck Grassley and Patty Judge. So this year we're going to see an even closer race, as Michael Franken really is giving Chuck Grassley a run for his money. Many of the most recent polls have shown Chuck Grassley only ahead by single-digit margins. However, I don't think that Chuck Grassley is actually going to win by such a small margin. I do think that he can win by double digits, but at this point, I don't expect Michael Franken to lose by a solid margin. So my prediction and the polling average puts Iowa as a likely Republican state. Next up, in Missouri, Eric Schmidt is in a pretty competitive election against Trudy Busch Valentine. Schmidt is up by 11.4%, so you could say it's pretty solid for the GOP, but it's still going to be an election to watch. Busch Valentine is not the greatest nominee. Eric Schmidt is not that special either, but this is going to be a pretty generic race. Missouri is not as red on the Senate level as it is on the presidential level. If you look at every single poll for this race, Eric Schmidt is yet to lead by a solid margin since winning the Republican nomination against his Democratic counterpart. And the election in 2018 was close between Josh Hawley and Claire McCaskill. McCaskill was the incumbent, so this was a pretty major flip for Republicans, as of course Josh Hawley defeated somebody who won by a solid margin just 6 years prior. Claire McCaskill defeated Todd Akin by 16 points. But in 2016, we saw an even closer election where Roy Blunt only won his second term by 2.8% against Jason Kander. But Roy Blunt was very unpopular, and Jason Kander was a very strong Democratic nominee. So we're probably going to see Republicans do better than they did in both 2016 and 2018. But I don't think the race is going to be quite as solid as they would like it to be. And so Missouri right now is only going to be a likely Republican state. In the state of Arkansas, this one is going to be pretty fast. John Boozman is up by 13%. This race is not going to be too competitive at all. I think that in the end, Boozman is probably going to win by 20 points. This poll is definitely going to be pretty inaccurate. Natalie James is the Democratic nominee. She stands absolutely no chance in Arkansas. Based on the polls, is going to be likely, but in reality, it's a pretty solid Republican state. Trump won it in 2020 by 28 points. And finally, in Louisiana, we have actually the open primary on the day of the election in November, and so John Kennedy is going to have to win a majority of votes outright against a whole slew of Democratic candidates if he wants to be the winner without a runoff. He is still going to win even if there is a runoff, but Gary Chambers seems to be the Democratic candidate with the highest chance at making it into a runoff if there is one, but still, this is going to be a very solid race for the GOP. John Kennedy is leading by 35 points, and he did actually win in a runoff by 21% in 2016 when he did not win a majority in the first round. At that point, he wasn't the incumbent, so he's definitely at a significantly larger advantage this time than he was last time, and so he's easily going to win his second term in office, making Louisiana a solid Republican state. And now we're going to cover the races here in the Midwest. We already went over Iowa and Missouri, so we just have the eastern part left. Starting off with the election in Wisconsin between Ron Johnson and Mandela Barnes. This really is one of the biggest elections of the year. Ron Johnson is a very vulnerable Republican, very unpopular in his state, and of course he's being investigated for his role in trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. I think that if something comes out about that in the next couple of weeks, it really could hurt his campaign, but Mandela Barnes seems like he's really not doing as well as he was before. He was up by 3.8% in the polling at one point, leading in every single poll up until a point after the primary. However, he has since lost his lead, with the most recent polls mainly showing Johnson as the favored candidate, but the most recent poll does have this race as even. But I think that Mandela Barnes is probably not going to win. He's going to have to be leading in the polls if he wants to win this election, as polls in Wisconsin have been known to overestimate Democratic support like they did in 2018, 2020, and 2016. Ron Johnson is still in a relatively good position. In 2016, when he won his re-election, it was actually a surprise win, as by all accounts, Russ Feingold was expected to take his seat back, but Ron Johnson has proven to be a pretty strong candidate in electoral politics, and so that's why I have Wisconsin as a leading Republican state, and the polls do as well. In Illinois, Tammy Duckworth is running for re-election after defeating incumbent Mark Kirk in 2016 by a solid margin. She's currently up by 17% in the polls, and she's on track to winning a second term pretty easily, maybe even by a larger margin than the last time as she was running against the incumbent senator. So Illinois is going to be a very solid Democratic state. Now in Indiana, we actually have some pretty surprising poll numbers. Thomas McDermott, a poll that his campaign released, shows him within 3 points of defeating Republican incumbent Todd Young, who actually only won by 9.7% in 2016. This was not the strongest margin. However, he was running against a former senator, that being Evan Bayh. Evan Bayh was the senator for, I believe, 12 years in the early 2000s, so he did run a pretty strong campaign against Todd Young, but Indiana had become just so much more of a GOP state since Bayh was in the Senate, and so Todd Young won by 9.7%, not even a double-digit margin. It definitely was a surprisingly weak win for the Republicans, but still a win for Todd Young. And so now that he's running for re-election, polls only show him up by 3%. I think it will be an outlier. I think that in the end, Todd Young is going to win by a much larger margin. I think a solid margin is definitely within the realm of possibility, but at least a double-digit margin is going to be possible for Todd Young here. But polls only suggest a lean margin of victory for him right now in Indiana. And in the state of Kentucky, we have Rand Paul running for his re-election, and he's up by 16 points against Charles Booker. And surprisingly, Rand Paul also did not win by a solid margin in 2016, only defeating Gray by 14.5%. So the state of Kentucky is going to be solid this time around, as Paul, of course, is up by 16 points. And now moving on to Ohio and Pennsylvania, we definitely have two big races here. In Ohio, Tim Ryan leads by 0.6% against J.D. Vance. I think this is a flippable race for Democrats, but it will still be very difficult. I still have Vance as the favored candidate, but recently, Siena College's A-rated poll shows Tim Ryan up by 3%. This is the first poll conducted by an A-rated pollster that has a Democratic candidate in the lead, and this really is a pretty big deal. And Marist College only had Vance up by 1, so we could see a very competitive election here in Ohio. I think it's still a bit far-fetched for Tim Ryan to win, but definitely this race is going to be one to watch, and polls currently suggest actually a tilt margin of victory for Democrats in this election as Rob Portman is retiring. And then in the state of Pennsylvania, John Fetterman is tightening his lead against Mehmet Oz. The race is closer than it was before. At one point earlier this month, Fetterman is up by 10.2%, but we are seeing a lot more better pollsters. I mean, for a very long time, he was up by significant margins, mainly due to many online polls, and polls that just really weren't that accurate, showing him up by double digits, maybe even 20% at some points, as you can see here, this Echelon Insights poll, but he was never going to win by that much. Pennsylvania was always going to be close, but if John Fetterman so far has led in every single poll, and I do think he is on track to winning his first term in the Senate and succeeding Pat Toomey. So right now, Pennsylvania is going to be a likely Democratic state, just like Arizona. And so we are starting to run a bit short on time, but I'm going to go over these races a little bit quicker, and so we'll still make this video relatively short. So starting off with New York, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, is running for re-election. He leads by 21 points in New York. Obviously, he is going to win re-election. The last time that a Majority Leader lost a Senate race was, I believe, all the way back in 2002, and that was in either North Dakota or South Dakota. I think it was actually South Dakota, but really it's been a very long time, and that rarely ever happened. Before that, I believe you'd have to go back to the 1950s to see a time in which a Senate leader actually lost their own Senate races. In Vermont, Patrick Leahy is retiring, and the only poll between Peter Welch and Gerald Malloy has Welch up by 7. This is going to be completely wrong. Democrats are going to win this race by a solid margin, but this poll was conducted by the Trafalgar Group, so it's going to have a very heavy Republican bias. But right now, this is the only poll that we have, so Vermont is going to be likely Democratic. And then in the state of New Hampshire, we do have a much closer race with Maggie Hassan running for re-election. New Hampshire simply is a more conservative state than the other states in the Northeast, and Hassan is in a pretty good position. I mean, before Don Bolduc won the Republican nomination, many polls showed a pretty close race between the two candidates, especially Chuck Morse, who lost by just 2% to Bolduc, but Bolduc has proven to be a very weak nominee, and so Maggie Hassan is currently on track to winning her second term in office by a likely margin. And then in Connecticut, we are seeing Richard Blumenthal on track to winning as well against Leora Levy. Blumenthal is up by 14.7%, so it's barely going to be a likely state, not going to be the solid margin that Democrats would have hoped for, but really doesn't matter too much. Richard Blumenthal will win his second term in office. And then finally, in the state of Maryland, we have the election between Chris Van Hollen and I believe Chris Chaffee. Van Hollen is the two-term incumbent, and he's up by 23% in the polls, so it's obviously going to be a solid race for Democrats. So most of the Northeast is going to be blue, including Pennsylvania and New Hampshire. And now we have just 5 races remaining, but we don't actually have polls from Alabama, so that's going to be solid for the GOP. Katie Britt will succeed Richard Shelby, who was one of the longest-serving American senators in American history. South Carolina is also going to be solid, as Tim Scott is up by 25 points on average. He is a much stronger candidate than Lindsey Graham was in 2020, when he only defeated Jamie Harrison by a double-digit margin, just 10%. And so now we have 3 races remaining. In North Carolina, Sherry Beasley is running against Ted Budd, and she's actually only down by 0.3%. Richard Burr, the incumbent, is not running for re-election, and so Ted Budd will probably be his successor, but this race is significantly closer than it should be, as Ted Budd should be winning by the 5-point margin he led by over the summer. North Carolina is now within range for Democrats, but Sherry Beasley is still not the frontrunner. 538 gives Ted Budd a 67% chance at winning this election. So I still have North Carolina as lean Republican, but the polls have it as being tilt. And then in the state of Georgia, we're seeing Raphael Warnock up by 2.1% against Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker, one of the worst Republican nominees in the country. I think just because he's the nominee, Republicans aren't going to win this race. If they nominated any other generic Republican, they would probably defeat Raphael Warnock. Warnock is a strong senator, but he's really in a very purple state, in a state that has a very long history of voting for Republicans. And so the most recent polls have been looking pretty good for Warnock, and I do expect right now Georgia to vote to the left of Nevada. I think the most likely way in which Democrats hold 50 seats is by winning Georgia and flipping Pennsylvania, not winning Nevada and flipping Pennsylvania. I think flipping Pennsylvania is inevitable at this point, but I don't think Democrats are favored in Ohio. Nevada will be very, very close. I personally have it as a pure toss-up, but I think that Georgia is going to be a state that Democrats have a better chance in than the Silver State. And so finally, in Florida, Marco Rubio is running for re-election, leads by 3.8% against Val Demings. This race is probably going to be likely for Rubio in the very end. I can definitely see him winning by over 5 points, but the polls currently suggest only a lean margin of victory, and that's going to make Florida the 3rd lean Republican state on this map. So this right here is the 2022 Senate map based on the latest polls. 52 seats for Democrats, 58 for Republicans. Definitely some very close races in Nevada, Ohio, and North Carolina. I think in the end, though, polls are going to be wrong in some of these states. I think that Arizona as well as Pennsylvania are going to be lean Democratic. I think Georgia is going to be very, very close. Florida is probably going to be likely. North Carolina also a bit up for Republicans. I'm going to move it into the lean category personally. And then states like Arkansas and Missouri, I think, may actually be solid. But overall, I think this map is going to not be too far off, as of course, I mean, these tilt ratings really mean that these elections can go both ways. So I have right now my map still at 51 to 49 or 50-50 personally, but this is only the map based on the polls alone. 52 seats predicted for the Democratic Party, 58 for the Republicans, and of course, this is updated at the very beginning of the month of October. The Senate elections are fast approaching, only 39 days to go, and I'll keep you guys updated on this channel as the midterms approach. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win the majority, and do you think polls will be correct? Do you think Democrats will actually flip Ohio? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next video.